What does it look like for us then to join him in the transformation, to actually be sent by him to our chapters? We talk about, well, if I'm not going to be alienated from my sisters and brothers and I'm not going to be assimilated to them, I need to follow Jesus into this sweet spot of incarnation. But then the question is, what does that look like?
When you think about Greek life, Christian faith might be the absolute last thing that comes to mind. But we not only believe that it's possible to be Greek and Christian, but also that it's the best way to experience Greek life and grow your faith. We have real, honest conversations about how to approach Greek life from a Christian perspective, including things like recruiting and pledging, drinking and drugs, sex and dating, leadership and philanthropy, and much more. This podcast is by Greeks and for Greeks. Our hosts and guests are all members of fraternities and sororities who collectively have decades worth of experience living out their faith in Greek life. Welcome to the Greek and Christian Podcast.
Welcome back to the Greek and Christian Podcast. My name is Sarah. I'm a Delta Gamma from Indiana State University.
I am John, better known to my fraternity brothers as JMac from Clemson University. I was a Sigma Nu alumni.
And I'm Kristina from University of San Diego. I was a Gamma Phi Beta.
Yay! Welcome back, everybody. We are here for episode 5. And before we get into, Kristina's going to lead us through our content today. And before we get into that, I was curious about, I want to know about your living situation on campus. Did you guys have houses? Did you live in your houses? What did your living space look like? Did you have roommates? What was the situation with that? Did you live in? And what was it like?
Why don't you go first, Kristina?
Okay, so I joined my sorority my freshman year, and we did not have houses. We had huge sororities. We met on campus in big meeting rooms. University of San Diego is right near the beach, so a lot of sororities and fraternities had kind of beach houses that they would pass down.
Such a rough life.
I know.
Amazing.
I know. Shout out to USD. We had one that was on so Gamma Phi had one called Devon 7. It was on 7 girls lived there all the time. And that's where everyone did, pre-activities before going out. But I lived on campus and I lived with some Gamma Phis the first couple of years. And then I made a switch halfway through because I needed kind of some separation from some of the craziness. So it was actually a good switch for me, but it was definitely a definite change that I noticed later on when I look back. But it was fun. I was at the beach.
And I'm just curious because I feel like things change with time. When you lived in with your sisters, what did your room look like? Did you have Gamma Phi stuff on the walls? Did you have a roommate?
Yeah. Well, Gamma Phi is known for crescent moons. So we had a lot of crescent moons hanging around. And it was generally just very messy. So that's really what I remember. Incredible mess, because you were always getting ready for something. You were always busy and no one cleaned up after themselves. And I did have one roommate that was incredibly wealthy. And she would throw away change and she just lived a different life,
Earning money, really? It's a little chilly. Let's go have a bonfire on the beach.
Isn't change annoying? I was like, well, it is.
And you're picking her change out of the trash or what? You're
I'm like, buddy.
Oh, it's like a points program. Every week you build up enough to get another cup of coffee while living with her.
Maybe I'll actually be able to pay for my dues this month. Anyways.
That's so funny.
Poor Kristina grabbing change out of the trash can. I'm over here wearing cargo shorts on the other side.
It's funny. What about you, John?
Yeah, so we had a few different living arrangements. Freshman year, I was in a dorm with everybody else. Sophomore year, we had, at Clemson, they have the quad, which houses all the on-campus fraternities and sororities. And so they're imagine big dorms, but every floor is a different fraternity or sorority. And then they had a couple of independent buildings that were their own fraternities and sororities. So we had one of those. Sophomores lived on the hall, as we called it. And then we had a fraternity house, which Sigma Nu used to have a house on the lake. So there's Lake Hartwell right by Clemson, and we had a lake house, which was pretty cool. That was one of our claim to fames. It makes it sound so luxurious, but I will say the lake house was not that luxurious on the inside.
Okay.
It was
not like Kristina's beach house, or maybe Kristina's
Southern
beach house.
California. Yeah, 75 and sunny. It was built in the 70s, old brick house, but housed a bunch of people Tons of fun though. Had a big back deck and a dock. Senior year, we just had houses like around campus that were always passed down. So like the Devon 7, we had different names. Like I lived in the White House, which was like this little white house that had always 4 senior guys lived in this house. Like from the time I was pledging to the time I graduated, when I moved in and graduated, we had the White House like right there on the corner to hang out in. So for me, I lived my sophomore year, I moved on to the hall with all my pledge brothers, which was super fun. And then I stuck around like Kristina. I was trying to find my ways to pay dues through school. My junior year, I chose to be the RA, the resident advisor. I don't even know what RA stands
for. Of your fraternity brothers? Like you were their RA?
Yes, because
Feels questionable.
when you lived on like the requirement, I think for Clemson was like every on-campus housing had to have some sort of RA associated with it. And so for the quad, it was just pick one of your brothers or sisters to like be the RA, you know. And it was a pretty chill job. I didn't have to do a bunch. It was basically like sitting the guys down at the beginning of the semester and it's like, don't be stupid. Just don't be dumb and I won't have to do anything and you don't have to get in trouble and we can just have a good time. So that's where I lived. Only a few of my pledge brothers hung out on the hall their junior year. The rest of my pledge class moved into the lake house. And then I was in the White House my senior year.
That's a lot of moving. Like you had a different designated place all 4 years.
It was a little bit hard to keep. I think our Black exec board was always stressed trying to fill all our housing, you know, we had to pay for all this stuff, you know, and older guys never wanted. We were like, we need some seniors to move back on the hall. And they're like,
no, thanks.
Some of my worst, I have so many good sorority memories, but some of my worst sorority memories are the chapters where the president is like, we're sitting in this room until the house is full. We're sitting in this room until every room, there's 2 girls signed up to live in every room of the house. And it would be like 3-hour meetings of people being like, well, you can live in, you can afford it. But yeah, it's horrible.
Goodness. Yeah, that sounds terrible.
What a mess.
I know, such a mess.
What about you, Sarah?
At Indiana State, all the fraternities had houses, but none of the sororities did except for Sigma Kappa. For some reason, I don't really know how they got around that, but they've always had a house. So we also had like sorority dorms. So Delta Gamma had like their own dorm building, really. And it was cute. It had letters on the front and pillars and letters in the back. And it looked like a cute little house, but really it was on campus. So it was a dorm. They were brand new my sophomore year. So I lived in the freshman dorms freshman year. And then sophomore year, I got to be like the first class of people to move into like our sorority dorm. And I lived in sophomore year, junior year, and senior year, and shared a room with my best friend Carly for all 3 of those years. And I had so much fun. I loved it so much. Like we got to pick where our rooms were and what floor we were on. So we just like my pledge class just like packed the first floor of the sorority dorm, and like all of my best friends lived next to me and shared a bathroom, like shared 3 bathrooms. So we would all get ready together. And it was like so much fun living with all those girls. And it was a dorm. So it felt like Kristina in the way that you're like, it was messy. Like ours was a dorm. So it was like not that bad. Like you were responsible for your own room and the bathrooms were fine. They'd always get like questionable around Halloween when you have like glitter everywhere, or, like fake blood places and stuff like that. But we had so much fun. I loved living with my sorority sisters. That was like some of the most fun moments of my life, was like living with all of your best friends in one place. Like you don't get that back after you graduate from college. So
I know.
I look back in that and I'm like, man, those were some really good years living with all your best friends. It's awesome.
Yeah, you were like a lifer almost, like
a lifer.
All 4 years.
No, literally.
Senior year, like a dinosaur living in the house.
No, literally, I was like super committed to living in, I guess. I don't really know why. That is kind of crazy. Like, why didn't I get an apartment? I don't know.
It was just too fun.
No, actually, it was just too fun. That's so true. Okay, awesome. Well, I think that Kristina will bring us back to that a little bit later in the episode, of our stories of living in and stuff like that. But let's go ahead and jump into the content. John, do you want to take us on a little bit of a recap of where we went last week?
Yeah, I can give it a little bit of a recap. So this season, we are asking the question, can you be Greek and Christian? And if so, how do you do that? And we've been making the case that you absolutely can be Greek and Christian. You can be fully invested in your faith and your sorority without compromising one of those. And in light of that, we've been exploring the question, okay, well, what does it look like to be Greek and Christian in your fraternity and sorority? What does it look like to navigate all the tensions and temptations that come with living in a culture that at times doesn't always align with our faith. And depending on your chapter, you maybe listen, you'd be like, yeah, I'm like the only Christian in my house. Or like, I think the culture of my chapter is actually like flowing against my faith. How do I navigate this? And so we've been coming at it from different angles, asking different questions of, why do we feel this tension? We spent some time in Genesis. We explored a question of like, should I stay or should I go? Last week, we explored the question like, are we being formed or just fitting in to our chapters? And how are we tempted to either assimilate, into the culture just to conform, to do what everybody else is doing, to go with the flow, or where are we tempted to kind of pull back and alienate? And specifically, we talked about different forms of engagement. We were looking at the book of Daniel. You could go back and listen to the episode, but in short, we propose like 3 different ways to engage, there are aspects of our chapter that, hey, you can fully engage because they're in alignment with your faith. So things like leadership development, brotherhood, sisterhood, philanthropy, like you should be the biggest promoters of those and have no qualms. There's other places that might not align with your faith or actually flow against your faith. And at those times, you can ask the creative question of like, how do I engage, but do so differently? How do I do common things in an uncommon way? And that's what Daniel really did, is he creatively engaged the culture that he was in. And then there's other times that, you might not be able to find a creative option to engage, and you might just have to respectfully take a step back, And so how do you disengage that in a way that honors your faith and friendships? So engage differently, maybe disengage. And so with that, we're going to continue exploring this question of how do you navigate the tensions of being Greek and Christian. And we're going to turn the page from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Today, Kristina is going to lead us into the New Testament with one of the Gospels. So Kristina, you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, I'm really excited. We've finally come to the Jesus section, although Jesus is in the whole Bible, so it's
The
fine.
moment everyone's been waiting for.
That's right. It's going to be, I like to call this episode Christmas in April. It's a thing. No, it's not really.
Oh,
We're going to talk about the birth of Jesus in April. Very unconventional of us. But, when we talk about, I love what we've been talking about on the podcast so much. And I've had so many conversations with students all over the country about it because I think it's hitting the tension that everyone feels. But the questions that I've been getting is like, but what does it really look like to live in the middle, like to live incarnationally like Jesus? That feels really hard and messy. And so we're actually going to look at, when we talk about the theological concept of the incarnation, most theologians would start with the birth of Jesus coming in the flesh. And so we're going to kind of get into that. We're going to look at John 1, which is really the kind of prologue to a biography of Jesus written by one of his disciples. And I think for most of us, when we think about the Greek system, it doesn't feel clean cut. It does feel messy. It does feel complicated at times. Sometimes we love our sisters, we love our brothers. Sometimes we want to kill our sisters and brothers because they're so annoying, or they make choices that you're like, want to strangle them.
They're throwing change away.
Yeah, they're throwing change away. But I do think when we look at the incarnation, it challenges us, instead of to follow that instinct of creating distance, of pulling away, it challenges us into this idea that like Jesus actually does the opposite. Instead of moving away from the mess or condemning people that are messy, he actually moves towards it. And so that's what we're going to look at John 1. And a little background, kind of said this a little bit, but John was one of the disciples who he was the last to write his biography. He had a lot of people believe he wrote his to show that Jesus was God. Like that was one of the main reasons that he took all of the stories, put them together, and really created this case. I often tell students, if you want to start with just learning about Jesus, like he wrote his biography, the Gospel of John, to really show like, here's 7 signs that show that Jesus was God, So it's a great one to read through if you haven't read through all of it. We're just going to read through kind of the prologue today. And I think the biggest thing I want to say as we start is, when we think about God leaving heaven and coming to earth as a human, in human form, still God, but also human is what we believe, it just raises a question right from the beginning of like, why would he do that? And so we're going to kind of like really try to answer that. Like, why would he do that? There's a lot of ways he could maybe like connect with people or do, I don't know, to help us, but that's what he decides to do, is to come in the form of a baby and live a full life here. So we're going to kind of talk through that. And so we're just going to dig right in. We're going to start with reading. We're going to get through all the first 14 verses of John 1, but we're going to start with just 1 through, I think, 9. If Sarah, you want to read that for us.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world.
So this is kind of where John starts. He actually, you might think he's talking about himself. He's actually talking about John the Baptist, which is also confusing. Like, did they not have other names? Is everyone called John? But
sure.
He is talking about kind of John. Yeah, and we also have a John on this podcast.
And we have our very own John. It's fitting.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's why he got this gig, because
his name. We were like, we actually can't do this without a John.
Yeah, we're like,
nothing to do with merit at all. It is purely semantics.
You'll work out. No, so I think before we get in, we're actually going to sit a lot in the verse 14 that's coming. But I thought this first part is really great because if we go back and look at it, there's a lot here. I mean, really, John is introducing themes that come throughout the whole Gospel of John, right in this beginning part. So I just wanted to kind of start, we like to say the best way to read scripture is to let the text speak first. Before we let it kind of inform our lives or what does it mean to me, we kind of say, what is it really saying? So what stands out to you about how Jesus is described here? Let's just say that what he's talking about when he talks about the word, and this is a recurring theme, it's probably helpful for me to say, the word is Jesus. So throughout the Gospel of John, he'll go back to that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Hebrews and Greeks kind of had this idea of the word being an embodiment and also an idea. So he's kind of naming it as Jesus, and he's saying all these things about him. So what stood out to you about what we read in the first 9 verses? What felt surprising? What did you notice?
It's interesting, like in the beginning is giving Genesis a lot. Like, isn't that how the Bible starts? Like in the beginning? Yeah. But it's also interesting. I was struck by that it's talking about how, like, it's talking about the beginning and it's talking about Jesus. So, like, Jesus was in the beginning, which I'm like, make sense. Like, Jesus was in Genesis, I guess. I have questions about that, but I thought that was really interesting how it talks about from the very beginning. That's it.
Yes.
Go back and fact check John. I'm like, I did not see Jesus' name in Genesis 1. Where is he getting this?
To be fair, Jesus' name is also not in John 1 so far. So
yeah, that's right.
True. Hey, fair enough. Good point. Yeah, so with that, yes, to the in the beginning is like reminiscent of like, oh yeah, first 3 words in Genesis is in the beginning. And then the word as in, you can think of this as like the written word, but I think in reference to Genesis, when you go back and read that whole passage, God isn't writing anything down. He's speaking. He's saying words, the whole 6-7 days it says God said, and then there was, and then he saw, and it was good. And that's the whole rhythm. God speaking is like making things happen. Life is coming from what he is saying. Creation, order. He's turning chaos into order and bringing nothingness into life by what he's saying. So there's like the Genesis kind of aspect of the word, which I think is pretty cool, that like, hey, what God was saying, when you read God said, that's kind of what John's referring to, this like creative, life-giving power that God had. But if I'm thinking just like, maybe it's a meta thought, maybe I'm getting too meta, but if you think of like words, what do we use with words? Words really reveal like what we're thinking and feeling and wanting on the inside, right? You probably have this, everyone's had the moment where they're like, I wonder what they're thinking. This comes up a lot in like dating relationships, right? Of just like there's a moment where you're together hanging out and you're like, I wonder what he's thinking right now, or I wonder what she's thinking. And you don't know until that person says something, right? You ask until they actually say something. Now you could read body language and stuff like that, but we can't see God. So it's like until God says something, like, what does God think? What does God feel? What is God like? What does God want? And we don't know until he actually says something, And to your point, Kristina, like making the equation of like, if Jesus is the word, it's kind of a cool concept to think of. Like, I'm sure people for all throughout biblical history in the Old Testament had the like thought of like, man, you have the 10 commandments and the laws and like God spoken through prophets and stuff like this. But like, wouldn't it be cool if like we could just like see what's God's like? Like, if he just like, if we could just see him at like, what do I do in this situation? Like how do I make this decision? Wouldn't it be nice if we just had someone we could turn to and ask, or if we could just see someone in action in these different situations? And what if we had like a living, breathing, walking, talking embodiment of God's thoughts, feelings, and desires? Wouldn't that be awesome? Lo and behold,
Totally.
there's this guy, Jesus, who shows up. The word, shows up. So I think as I was thinking about this passage and reading, that was kind of the thought that was coming to mind, for me.
Yeah, I love that too. And I love that there's this idea that in the beginning, we're not going to get into the whole theology of the Trinity today, but there is this sense of
Aw.
yeah, I know. Not today, John. But I will say there is this beautiful picture of God being both, the creator and then the one who is sent to earth too. Like being both and being there together when the world was created, being pre-created, like they weren't created by anything else, but they were there. And then through him, the one God, different persons, everything was made. And without him, nothing was made that's been made, So there's this beautiful, it's like this, it's kind of like God is so big in that beginning few statements. It's hard to even, like you're saying, John, like wrap your mind around how do I even have a concept of what a relationship with something like that would be. It feels so big and giant. And yet then there's this sense of like, there's these beautiful metaphors, like all life comes from him. There's this bit about light that comes. Why do you think they mention this witness right in the middle? So there's like this bit about the word, Jesus, and then then they kind of introduce John the Baptist as a witness. And what do you think this bit about the 6 through 9, the light that's coming into the world, and then what John says about himself? Why do you think that's there?
Great question. I mean, one thought that comes up that feels very reminiscent of Genesis, if you just think about the creative process, what happens on day one, because the whole story starts out with like darkness and there's these like chaotic kind of waters, but God's there and he's hovering over the waters. And then day one, the famous like, let there be light, and in darkness comes light. It's the first creative act of God to send light into the darkness of which nothing else, could come or exist, thereafter. So is now, if you fast forward to John's gospel, then it's absolutely wild that it isn't. Honestly, it feels like John has to be like, this is where like C.S. Lewis, it's like it's either liar, lunatic, or Lord, right? He's making this audacious claim. John's either crazy to say that like, because what he's claiming is like Jesus, that light that came into the darkness, like, yeah, that's Jesus,
Yeah.
and that's what he's doing here, which is a huge claim to make. Like you're either crazy, to make that statement, it's not true, or maybe like they're testifying to something that's like, actually very true.
Yeah. I think also that it's helpful to know that this was pretty dark times for people. They hadn't heard from God in hundreds of years. The prophets had been silent. There had been great oppression that had been happening politically to the Jewish people. It just wasn't, even the religious people were pretty hard and corrupt in some instances. And so there is this idea of light and darkness would have been a very philosophical concept. They would have known. It would have been like, and they would have actually resonated with it as like, well, yeah, we're not living in the Genesis days of like when everything was good. We are living in the fallen days where we don't know if God even is going to speak again. We don't know if he even cares about us. We're not sure if we'll ever have light again. And then there's this phrase right in the middle where it's like, the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. And there's a lot of we could say about, we're going to actually get into light in a later episode, but I do think that there's this sense of hope that kind of comes through right at the beginning of the gospel that makes you curious, especially if you were like in a dark situation or a hard situation, and you'd be like, wait, the darkness hasn't overcome it because we haven't heard, like, say more, because I'm not sure. And then there's this witness that's like, I am not the light, but I can tell you there is a light that you need that can actually push out darkness and change things. And so and then that Jesus would possibly be that would probably invoke a lot of curiosity, I would think. Any other things that you think about that first section that just kind of speaks to you, or kind of you want to think more about it?
I mean, to that end, it makes me think of like the famous Christmas kind of verses, right? That you get on Christmas cards with, from family members and stuff that, there's the Isaiah one that's really famous. And Isaiah, what chapter is it? 9 verse 2, like the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a land light has dawned. And then later in verse 6, for unto us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting, all the things, all the Christmas things that you see ornately written on cards and stuff like that. But in that sense, if you're to put it back in that context, like if I'm a Jewish person living in the first century, and I'm experiencing the oppression that you're referring to, Kristina, and I've grown up on this like national kind of hope of like, hey, God's not going to leave us here. Like God's coming. Like one day, it's dark now, but one day, this is what like grandparents used to sit their children down and say, listen, I know times are tough now, but one day God's going to send someone and it's going to be good. And that's a little bit of what, again, John's claiming here. The writer of John, I guess, is saying like, hey, that moment, that person we've been waiting for, that light, that we've been waiting for the sunrise to come, he's here, Yeah. That person is here.
Yeah, that's really good. And I do think there's a lot of relevance. I know we're going to talk about it in terms of the Greek system, but I think just in our world today, we're experiencing a lot of that feeling of like, where is God in this world right now? It's really hard. And yet I have a lot of hope just in these few verses of reminding me that the true light that gives light to everyone is it. And so there's a lot of implications for that. And it also takes a lot of faith to believe that. So let's keep reading. I want to make sure we get to kind of where we want to land in verse 14. But if we can just read 10 through 14.
Mm-hmm. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born from God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have been his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth.
So you see, we've been talking about how this would be so curious, but then the very next verse is he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. And as you kind of look at these verses and we keep going, the Message version of verse 14, which is a paraphrased version of scripture, but one we like to talk a lot on the podcast and just in Greek ministry in general, is that the word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. So it's like this sense of just really coming into the world that we live in. What are things that stand out to you when this word becomes flesh? Like, what are the responses of people? What do you kind of notice about this section that is surprising to you?
Kristina, just to clarify, so like we just talked about in verse 6, how there was like John who came before Jesus and he was like a witness. So he's like telling people that this is about to happen and they're kind of like, oh, wait, what? They're feeling curious, maybe a little bit hopeful. And then it does happen. And then what does happen is that they don't recognize him. Like John is saying all these things. People are like, amazing. Could this like be what we're waiting for? And then all of a sudden, like people don't recognize him.
Yes.
Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah. And a lot of that was, the circumstances of Jesus's birth were really crazy. So you had it would be one thing if, like the embodiment of God came down in like an adult form from the clouds and, kind of
looking like a
appeared.
king.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like here we go. I think a lot of people would be like, oh, okay. Like kind of how we think about maybe the return of Jesus a little bit. Like, I mean, there's a lot of different views on that, but this was, it was prophesied he would come as a baby, born to a virgin, and have no real earthly parents in terms of, except for Mary, but it was really the Holy Spirit impregnating her. And it was a crazy story from the beginning. I mean, it was so crazy that in the beginning of Matthew, Joseph, who is betrothed to Mary, an angel has to come to him, of course, because he's like, what this, you can imagine being like engaged to somebody and she's like, I am pregnant, but like, I swear I didn't have sex yet. And they're like, okay, well, probably just need to like break this off and you need to get some mental help, but an angel came to Joseph and had to say, listen, she is going to really birth the Messiah. And he quotes Isaiah actually in his moment with Joseph. And he says, when he comes, he will be called Emmanuel, which really means God with us. And so but you can imagine he's still a baby. He's born as a baby and he has to go through all the growth, as someone who has 3 kids that are now teenagers, all those stages, with Mary and Joseph. And I don't think anyone during those stages were looking at Jesus as like the hope, the light of the world, like he was a kid. Sure. And there was just a lot of confusion about that. So I think there was a little bit of that, but it was also, I mean, I want us to get to that question of like, why does God come like that? It's so interesting to me. But so when this is written and what comes right after this is really Jesus as an adult. He comes onto the scene in his early 30s, maybe 29, 30. So we jump a lot. And so I think that's when he starts really saying some provocative things. He starts kind of wanting people to know who he is. But up until that point, I think people just didn't recognize him. But yeah, there's that. I mean, what are some of the other responses or things that it says in the scripture that are interesting about, what do you think verses 12 and 13 mean for the people who do receive him? There's some that don't recognize him, but then there's some that do.
Yeah. Well, we were kind of y'all were talking about how it says like the world did not recognize him, which is kind of the unassuming nature, right? Like you would assume, hey, if we're standing in a dark room and someone turns on the light, like you wouldn't miss that. But he didn't come like that. It was very unassuming, like the whole born in a manger, and think this isn't how kings show up. This isn't how royal announcements are made. And so I think that does speak to some like they didn't recognize him. The other part that it says in verse 11, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him, which is different from just recognizing. But as Jesus started to live his life and do those things, the inexplicable miracles, the healings, all those sorts of things, the provocative teaching that he was doing, people started to recognize like, you couldn't do these things if you weren't from God, right? Like Nicodemus in John 3 even comes to him and he's like, listen, we're the religious leaders. Like we know nobody can do this stuff unless you've got like some insider connection, and some power. Recognizing someone and receiving someone is different. You could recognize them as a person of, power and influence and, like maybe he is the Messiah. Maybe he is the person we've been waiting for. But do you like him? Do you receive him? Do you believe that he is that person? Do you accept him and the things that he's doing? And if you read throughout the rest of the Gospels, there's mixed reactions to Jesus. He's a very polarizing figure, like wherever he goes, there's always like 3 groups of people. There's one group of people that like, man, this is the guy that we've all been waiting for. Like, you're the Lord. Praise God, you're here. Yeah. Then there's always a crew that's like, TBD. Like, yeah. I don't know about this guy. There's something about this guy that's really provocative. There's something going on here. But is he the Messiah? I don't know. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. They're trying to figure it out, if you will. And then there's a third crew that's like, absolutely not. Like, we don't like this guy. We don't believe the things that he's doing. Like, they just refuse and kind of reject him, and those would, like, the irony of it all, those are the religious leaders, the very people who should have been the ones to like be most apt to recognize him, but they end up being the ones that don't receive him, and reject him and eventually obviously have him killed.
Yeah. What do you think this idea of, those that do receive him, the one category you're talking about, they actually become children of God. And then there's this bit about they're not born of natural descent or of human decision or a husband's will, but they're born of God. I mean, I think we talk about this maybe in the evangelical spaces as like born again Christians or whatever, but I just think this is a really beautiful promise. What do you think it means though? Like what does that really mean for people that they would be born?
That's such a good question. If I think about, I'm really lucky. I have like amazing parents who love me a lot. And I'm really lucky with the parents I've been given. So this is like great news because I'm assuming, God is like an amazing parent, Jesus be an amazing parent. So that promise is awesome. And you would think, like, in all of the ways that my parents have cared so well for me and protected me and provided for me and, yeah, like made a home for me, that would be true of what God promises for his children too, which is cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. I mean, it takes it out of the theological kind of like distant kind of God as a thought or a concept or like a invisible spiritual being and but to be a son or daughter of God, to be born of God, puts it in very familial language like you're talking about, which would have been I think that's an idea in the New Testament that comes out that isn't as prevalent in the Old Testament as the idea of like God is our Father. There was that idea in the Old Testament, but it was really Jesus who championed it and in his prayers saying things like our Father, and referring to God not as this like high Lord God, all powerful, almighty, all knowing, like those sorts of things, but like bringing him with language that feels really close of like, but he's also like a father. He's like a dad who loves you and cares for you. And yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
definitely
I mean, it is really beautiful, like, to think of God like we just said in the beginning, it felt like he's like this bigger than life, you can't even wrap your mind around, like, I mean, if you just look up to the stars and you're like, "Oh my gosh," or anytime you've been in awe of creation in general, and you're like, not only is he gonna come close, but then there's this promise of, like, if I receive him, that I could actually be brought under him as a parent, like that close of a relationship. It also kind of implies, and we get to this later in John even more explicitly, it also implies that you need to be born again. Like that there's a sense of like, later in John 3, he kind of says to Nicodemus, like, you must be born again. You're actually spiritually dead unless the Spirit of God brings you back to life. So there's also a little bit of a missional kind of thread that's like he's actually like doing something by coming to earth that really can only happen by his presence there to bring us back to life, kind of like, and he uses that language. Let's talk about verse 14 because I think it's so important to where we're going to land today. What actually does it mean that the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us? Like, what does that mean if this is really God, that decided to come, put on kind of flesh, come as a baby, make his dwelling among us, live this perfect life as a human all the way through to adulthood? What does that mean? Like, I don't know. Any of your thoughts? Either what does it mean? Why did he do that, do you think? What are some reasons? What do you think?
Can you say the Message version again?
Yeah. So the word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood.
That's crazy considering like God is God and God is like all powerful and God could do whatever he wanted and have anything he wanted and he chose to like become a human man and chose to become a human man like as a baby to like a poor couple and then you said spent 30, however many 30 years just like being a person, not even like doing like miraculous and really eye-catching things. That was his choice of how he wanted to be near to his people is to like come in that way, which is crazy because he could have come in like so many more powerful and flashy and impressive ways. Yeah, and moved into the neighborhood. I love that. I like the imagery of like Jesus as a normal person walking around. Like I could literally imagine Jesus as a normal person walking around my own neighborhood. That was the choice. To be with his people in that way is like really kind of mind-boggling, but also amazing to think on.
Yeah, I think that's right, Sarah. Like there's the first really powerful thing is just like him wanting to be present with his people, kind of what you're saying, like wanting to be with them instead of just shouting it from the heavens or sending messengers time and again, like actually being present in the world. There's something about that even contradicts a lot of religious narratives out there, of just a God who would come that close and be that present in the middle of the everyday, like you're saying, like in the neighborhood, like there. So I think that's really good.
Yeah.
What were you gonna say, John?
Yeah, which isn't a novel concept. I know sometimes we can take like really dichotomize like Old Testament, New Testament, and like, oh, this is like Jesus is really like the God showing up. But, if you go back to the beginning, all throughout like the biblical story, God has had a desire to be close, not distant with his creation, and particularly people who reflect his own character and image and everything, So like if I'm being Bible geeky, it taps into what we biblical scholars would refer to as like temple theology, but like the presence of God among us. How does God show up in this space on earth? And it's like, well, the garden, you get examples of like God wanting to walk with Adam and Eve in the garden. He comes to walk with them. And then here in this actual the passage, like the original Greek, I think the Message version is really cool. It says the flesh and blood, came and moved into our neighborhood. The moved, or if you read like another version, the NIV version, it says like he made his dwelling among us. Like the original word dwelling is really tabernacled, which if you've grown up in or around church and you hear tabernacle, it's like, oh yeah, that's like that tent thing that they had built in Exodus, right? Which it was like, first you have the garden, then you have the tabernacle where like, they build it and then God's spirit comes down and fire and smoke and everything. And there's the whole tabernacle moment in history. Then you fast forward to like when they're in the land and they build a temple, right? In Jerusalem. And what happens when they finish building the temple? God's presence come down, in the fire and smoke and everything. And so you have these moments all throughout the story that God keeps wanting to show up in our midst. Like, I think we take it for granted that, like, especially if you've grown up in or around church, I think we take it for granted that, like, oh, God loves you. God wants to be close to you. But why do we assume that? If you're God, like, it's not a given that, like, you have to be close. Like, he doesn't have to be close or want to be with us or in our presence. And yet, throughout the whole biblical story, that's been his desire, is to, like, want to be with us, not distant from us, but to be with us. And so, you have these moments all throughout the story. And then lo and behold, here comes like not another building, but a body. Like God's spirit shows up in a body, in a person, living, walking, talking, breathing embodiment of God himself,
Yeah, it's really beautiful. And it also is such a good reminder that when anyone says, I don't know what God is like, you point them to Jesus. I mean, he lived so much. We know so much about him. We know, he is the one that we look to as our example, as not only our savior, but the one who lived perfectly, that lived this life the way it should be. I mean, it's kind of like what you said, John, like he didn't have to come this way. What else does it show us about what God is like, that he would actually live all the stages, that he would like start out as a baby and like live throughout puberty years and like get to, get to be an adult. And you know what I mean? Like, what does that say about a God who would live the human seasons like that, I guess? Like, what are some of the things that shows us about who God is too? I love the idea that he's so present, but is there other things that shows us about who he is and like what he's like? Why would he do it that way?
I think it speaks to that God cares about us, period. God cares about us, period. But also what God cares about knowing us and experiencing what we experience and us being able to relate to him, I think, and to be able to be like, I see myself in Jesus, or like there's nothing that I have experienced that Jesus hasn't also experienced, because that's the way that God chose to be with us, which feels incredibly intentional and also like so humble. Like, Kristina, your son plays soccer. He's a huge soccer player. Like, if he did that and you never like entered into the soccer world and you were just like, oh, good for you, like, love that you love soccer, but because you love your son so much, you're like, I need to figure out, I need to know everything I need to know about soccer.
That's right.
I want to have like the merch to wear to the games and things like that. Like, God loves us and Jesus loves us and cares about our experience and us being able to like relate to him, I think.
Totally. Yeah, I think there is like a sense of identifying with us in a way that couldn't have happened any other way. It's kind of like I read a lot of fictional stories, but if you ever read stories about the king that never comes out of his castle, and you're like,
Right.
he doesn't even know what's happening, and his subjects are suffering, and he doesn't understand their problems, and yet he's like trying to rule them. And no one would ever say that about Jesus. I mean, Jesus entered into the human experience in such a way that he never chose riches. He never chose power. He never chose those things he could have, even when he was tempted. And, the Bible even says like he was tempted in every single way we were tempted and yet did not sin. So I think there is something about that. I love that analogy of like being able to be in our experience that couldn't have come any other way. And I think it also challenges what we might think about God too. Because we might think, well, God doesn't really get it. Like he doesn't have to live in 2026. He doesn't have to deal with my stuff that I don't know why he put me in this horrible family that I'm in or whatever it is that we're just like, he doesn't get it. He's far off. He can't understand. I think that there's a little bit of Jesus like from the beginning. I mean, he even lived so uncomfortably, I'm sure the entire time he was a human, in the flesh. In that form. And then I think the last thing that I see is really this idea of he came for transformation, so he didn't just come to like identify with us or be present with us, but there's this sense of like Jesus comes, we talked about being born again and like bringing life where there was death or light where there's darkness. And he found a way. We talk about this a lot in the Christian kind of narrative that the fall that happens in Genesis actually creates a huge separation between people and God. No longer are we kind of in this deep communal, relationship with God because we made choices to be distant. We made choices to do that. And so there is the sense that Jesus comes in the flesh and makes his dwelling and lives that life so that he can also live the death that we deserve, right? So when you think about the transformation piece, where do you kind of see that in this passage, or where do you kind of see that about Jesus when you think about his story and who he is and incarnation in general and like how incarnation can bring transformation? How would you kind of unpack that a little more?
Can I tell you a gross story from college? Like a
I
gross.
love gross stories.
This is the random thought I had, but I think there's a point. So stick with me. It's to the point of like, how does Jesus bring transformation? Let's take it back to Greek life. And we talked about like moving in and living situations and everything. And I mentioned all the juniors lived at the fraternity house, the lake house, which was awesome in concept, but kind of dilapidated on the inside. There was we had a chapter room, it was called, and like people lived in the chapter room, and there was one bathroom in the chapter room. Okay. So we have, right, the fraternity house, we're hosting parties like every weekend, and there's hundreds of people, band parties and everything. And you've got one bathroom, right?
Gross.
So you just told you it was gross. You
You
just
did.
think of all the stuff that goes down this one toilet, if you will, like for hundreds of people weekend after weekend. So it's all good and well, right? Until one morning, one of the guys that lived in the chapter room was taking a shower, right? This story comes out when, like at chapter meetings, and so the guy said that he was taking a shower and then he looked down and realized there was like the water was turning dark. And then it turned like black, and then it started smelling.
Oh no.
And he realized, like, oh my gosh, there's literal like crap, sewage coming out of my shower drain, So set forth, like these guys tried to get Drano, they tried to plumb it, they tried to plunge into all these homemade remedies and stuff. Like you could imagine a group of fraternity guys standing around like how are we going to fix this thing? Turns out like they could not do it. It just like kept coming up and everything. So we had to hire a plumber. And plumber comes out, like he looks at it and he's like, oh yeah, that's super gross. You're not going to be able to get to it that way. I'm going to have to go and like open up the main like sewage pipe, drain pipe to the house, if you will. So he like goes out into the yard and digs it up and everything. Long story short, he resolves the problem. Also says that in his like 20 years of plumbing career, it's the grossest thing he's ever seen.
Of course.
which is like a claim to fame to the
Yeah,
fraternity. We're
you
like,
win the
oh
award.
Yeah.
Here's why that story comes up. Like, why am I telling this gross story?
I'm loving it.
The guys, we could not solve the problem from the outside in. The only way you could resolve the problem and all this mess was from the inside out. Like, you had to go to the source and the like clog in the main part and resolve it, you know? And so going back to like the context of the story, right? This is um like almost makes me emotional, but like this is a people that's like, man, they're suffering. They're in a mess. Like the whole biblical story is kind of like, again, God created this good world and he wanted to spread this goodness and we kind of made a muck of it, you know? And we needed someone to come save us from this mess that we have created. So I think one of the underlying questions of the whole biblical story is God saying, like, how am I going to deal with the mess? You know? Yeah. And here's the wild thing is that God didn't just stand at a distance and pour Drano, you know? He didn't just stand at a distance and try to plunge it or turn his nose up at it or, you know, send someone else to do it. God went and like came and got knee deep into the mess with us. And he solved it. He cleaned us everything up from the inside out, you know? And again, I don't think you could take that for granted. Like God could have done a lot of things, but he doesn't try to solve it from a distance. He comes and he doesn't do the outside in approach. He does it from that. He transforms from the inside out.
Yeah. No, I love that. I mean, really what you're talking about is what we call the gospel. And it really is this idea that we couldn't fix ourselves, that we needed the only one that could fix the mess that we were in and create kind of pull us back into relationship with God was this plan, this incarnation crazy plan. C.S. Lewis calls it the grandest miracle. The most important miracle was the incarnation, because without it, nothing else, no other miracles could flow from it. And it is very true. I mean, when we think about it, I think that there's this sense of awe, and also just it is so amazing that God is that humble and good. And I also love that it has this element in the wording in verse 14 of he comes in grace and truth, which I think is a very hard. I think we could have a whole nother season on that tension. But I think that's a very amazing way that God comes. He doesn't come just like excusing our issues, but he comes with both. When I was in college, there was this incident that happened in my sorority where a girl got caught doing something that was very public and very against the values of my sorority. And they brought her into standards, which is what we called it. I think they've changed the name now, but that's what we called it. We had like standards, and then you would have to go before this panel of yours, you know, and it was not fun. Usually you got like some kind of consequence. But this time I was actually on the standards committee, but I was like the youngest member. I was new to it. And this girl gets brought in and they graphically tell what she's done. Like there was witnesses, like all this stuff. And I'm sitting there like, oh, I feel like this is not like this is personal and I feel uncomfortable. And I could feel her shame like just radiating off of her, you know? And she was just pleading, you know, can you help me? But there's certain bylaws in my sorority of like certain things get certain consequences. And they just decided to kick her out of the sorority. And I was sitting there like, wow. So it was like an example of like leaning into truth. Like we had rules, we had ways that, you know, we dealt with that. There were not consequences that we all knew would happen if you did certain things. And in a lot of ways, like she broke all of those rules. And so she needed to pay the consequence. But there was just a part of me that was like, wanted grace so badly, you know, because I loved her and I cared about her. And I just felt like there needed to be, and I could feel the weight of the shame that she was carrying too. And so even as we talk about this idea of incarnation, there are moments in our sororities and fraternities where we might lean one way or the other. The other way is we can lean grace and like there's no standards, you know, like we're living in this, you know, world where everyone's kind of doing destructive behavior. No one's actually helping people hold to like some goodness. But I do think there is that tension. And I love that Jesus embodies both, because he's the only one who can. Yet, even as he embodies both, he wants to be close to us and not distant from us as he holds those tensions. So I think as we think about this idea of incarnation, if God moves towards us, I think I wanted to kind of end with this idea of what does it look like for us then to join him in the transformation, to actually be sent by him to our chapters. We talk about, well, if I'm not going to be alienated from my sisters and brothers and I'm not going to be assimilated to them, I need to like follow Jesus into this sweet spot of incarnation. But then the question is, what does that look like? So I wanted to spend a few minutes, because I know you all have a lot of stories, and talk about this idea. One of the ideas that we talk about in the podcast in previous seasons is this idea of chapter ministry. So instead of just seeing yourself as a member of your chapter as a Christian, you actually kind of say yes to this idea of like, maybe God could use you as a chapter minister. And it's not, I guess some chapters have like chaplains. My sorority changed the chaplain to Sunshine Chair. So
you guys have such weird names for
it's
things.
very
like
California.
Angel Sister, Sunshine Chair.
And it has no religious meaning anymore. But
Delighted
anyways,
to hear this.
I don't think that, but I'm talking about something a little deeper than that. When we talk about chapter ministry, obviously the Sunshine Chair, but even maybe than chaplain, unless you really take that seriously. And so I wanted to kind of look through, if we look at the incarnation as the three things we've mentioned, kind of this idea that like Jesus is present. He shows up intentionally. He also kind of identifies with people. He's not above them. He doesn't act like he's better than everyone else. He touches lepers. He does all these things that are very like with the people. And then this idea that he also looks at mess and brokenness, and he does have hope that there could be light that could go in the darkness, that things could be different and more beautiful and more helpful. So as we think about chapter ministry, for some people, when they think of themselves as a chapter ministry leader, the reason we kind of, there's lots of ways to think about ministry in the Greek system out there among people. We know some people think of it as like, well, we just get a priest or a minister to come in and give a good message to the chapter, which is not wrong and is one way. But again, that kind of leaves out the identification piece. Has that priest ever been in a fraternity? Probably not. But you never know. And I would say it's just different than having someone among you kind of lead a discussion and talk about faith. And so I know for me, when I was in my sorority, no one would come to church with me. That was not like, if I would say, hey, would you come to church with me? They'd be like, no. Like I'm busy on Sundays. I do intramurals. I do all this other stuff. But when I started to think of myself as like, what if I led a Gamify discussion about faith? Like, what if that was something, and that is what we're talking about. When we talk about chapter ministry, we talk about going from the inside out, what John was talking about. Instead of like coming from the outside and be like, come with me, we're actually going and sitting on a living room couch in the middle of a fraternity house. And we're seeing this happen around the country. We're going to give an example at the end, but I thought we could just list off some practical ways. So through these ideas, like when you think about chapter ministry through the first lens of presence, of showing up intentionally, what are some things that we could give as advice to people listening to this? So like, what does that really mean to show up intentionally as opposed to what I'm already doing? What are some tips or things that you could add to that idea of being more intentional and present?
I joked about at the beginning, like, well, I don't know why I didn't get an apartment. It was actually intentional. Like, I had a mentor who challenged me. That's why I lived in for my whole college career. I had a mentor who challenged me, and I was like leading, like you were talking about, Chris, your gamified discussion. I was like leading a Bible study for my sisters, and when I was a junior girl, a younger girl was going to take it over for me. And I was like, I'm going to move into an apartment like with my friends. And, that's what seniors do. And I had a mentor who was like, what if you didn't? Like, what if you were the senior that stayed in the house and you continued to like go to the Bible study and support the girl that was taking it over after you? And like, it was like a pretty big culture in my chapter. I think this is pretty common that seniors are like a little bit removed, especially from freshmen. Like it's pretty common that seniors don't necessarily know the incoming pledge class. And she was like, what if that wasn't your story? What if you got coffee with the freshmen and invited them to Bible study and invited them to things and were intentional about spiritual discussions? And I did that. And I got my friends to stay with me too. I got a couple of other senior girls to stay in the house with me. And I'm so glad I did that. It was so much fun. Just even aside from like the ministry of it all, it was so much fun to stay in the house for that long. But it was also, that was also like when I was a senior, that was also the most confident I was in my relationship with Jesus. And I had just come off leading a Bible study. So I knew what I was doing, and I like knew how to do ministry in the house. And it was like pretty fruitful, had a lot of really good conversations, and the Bible study grew a lot that year. And I think so much of that was like my mentor's challenge to be like, what if you stayed and continued to like be with people and like live in the space where you have conversations in the hallway and you're getting ready for a party together, and like there's just like little moments that all add up into people being curious about Jesus that you miss when you're not like moving into the neighborhood and like actually dwelling among the people that you're trying to reach.
Yeah, that's great. Any other things you'd add to that, John?
I mean, going back to my personal story, you know, like I said, I joined Greek life for none of the noble reasons. So it was for the work hard, play harder lifestyle. But when I started following Jesus, you know, there was the personal moment of like, oh, wow, everywhere I was looking for life and the good life and living your best life, like, that's Jesus. Like, Jesus is the good life. And it was awesome. I was like so compelled by how good it was that it's just like, man, I just want everyone to know about it. Everyone has to get in on this. Like, this is awesome. And who more do I want to know about it other than like my best friends, you know, and all the girls that we hung out with. And so it was just a very natural, like, hey, you experience good things, you share about them. And so for me, it was like, I remember going back to the quad, you know, the fraternity and sorority housing at Clemson. I remember there was one night where I was sitting at the top of the quad looking out and just thinking, man, we have like all these great churches around campus, you know, and we have all these amazing campus ministries, some that have like thousands of people going to them. Like, they're awesome, but none of the like guys and girls that I hang out with are going to them. And when they do go to them, they come back and they say things like they feel like they don't fit in, or they feel like people give them weird looks, or they just feel like out of place, you know? And so my thought was like, man, how wild would it be if there was a place just for Greek students to come and just encounter and follow Jesus, you know, together? Like, how wild would that be if something existed like that in Greek life? And it was from that concept that I ended up getting connected to the ministry we work with. And that's very much a part of like our vision and strategy, like Kristina's talking about, is, you know, not trying to pull your brothers and sisters out into some other spiritual space, you know, like, by all means, take your brothers and sisters to church, you know, if they want to go, absolutely take them to church. Take them to another, if you're involved in another like ministry on campus, take them to that other ministry on campus. Those are awesome spaces. But the reality is that like, not all your brothers and sisters, maybe most of your brothers and sisters might not feel comfortable in those spaces. But what if there was a place within your own fraternity and sorority, maybe within your own fraternity and sorority house, like right there in the lounge or the one of the rooms, where your brothers and sisters could show up to have conversations about faith and what it looks like to follow Jesus, whether or not they follow Jesus or have ever thought of him before, you know? I mean, the comfort of your own house with someone who they know and trust and spend all their time with. And we talk about that all the time. I mean, Sarah, you alluded to it. Like, please recognize, if you're listening to this and you're in college right now, I mean, that is the audience, but like, this is such a unique moment in life. Never again will you live in a house where you are surrounded by 30 to 50 of your best friends. Like, it just doesn't happen outside of it. And recognizing that moment, you have a unique opportunity to provide a place for them to come and explore faith, you know? And we think because you have the relationship, like, you're one of the best people to do that. You know, more so than any pastor or parent or professor. Like, no one else has the unique relationship that you do, or the trust that you do, to have those conversations about faith. And so what if you, again, a lot of this season we've been talking about, how do you just live out your own personal faith, you know? But like, what if you actually started to share that faith with your brothers and sisters? What would that look like? And it's our strong conviction, based on what we've been talking about, that I think the best way to do that is not by pulling them out of the fraternity or sorority house and putting them into some other spiritual space, but to do what Jesus did and to straight up move into the neighborhood, to move into the house, and to create that space right in the place, right in the midst of it, you know, even if it's one of the messiest places that you could possibly imagine, in the room that smells like stale beer and regret and like disheveled furniture. Like, what if that was the place that you had a conversation about faith or started a Bible study, And that's what I ended up doing. And, I could tell many stories of like some of the wildest conversations that happened there or in other places. Some of my most spiritual conversations did not happen in churches. They didn't happen at campus ministry gatherings. They happen late night in bars and smoky, loud bars. They happen late night in fraternity lounges. They happen late night in the White House when I lived there, at 2 a.m. when I'm talking to a buddy and he's like, do you really believe all this Jesus stuff? And it's like, man, those are the moments. Those are beautiful moments of like, that's Jesus in your neighborhood. He's in your house, and it's cool to be a part of that.
Yeah, I love that. I think as we think about being present and being intentional, I think it does. I can remember the moment that I shifted from, well, somebody else needs to do that to like God being like, why don't you do that? And that being terrifying. Like fears just rise to the surface. You're like, somebody else would be better at this. Like I'm not the person. And I know I've coached so many students over the years that are like, couldn't someone else do it? I'm like, I think God is choosing you, like I think it's actually you're the one to influence, but you can't influence where you aren't present, like it's just it's impossible. And so these last two things where it's kind of identifying with people, not being better than them or over them, but also desiring transformation to happen in your house. What are some kind of stories about that? I think well, I'll just start. One of mine that I felt really challenged for a long time was we would get these big composites, and my story was really big. And I would look at the composites and I'd be like, who is this? I'd be like, who's this girl? Like, what is her name again? Like, I was just like, I don't even know this person. And I'm like, does she look like this? Like, does she ever come to meeting? I didn't know a lot of the younger girls, like Sarah's saying. And I felt the Lord kind of say, I want you to actually get to know these women. Like they are the kind of the field that I've planted you in to plant seeds. And you can't do that if you're like, I don't know, I only know my pledge class and that's good enough for me, And I really had to like be intentional about asking people if they wanted to go to coffee. And it was awkward sometimes. It was not easy. My husband wrote a book on evangelism and the name of the book is Beyond Awkward. And he always says as Christians, we actually need to pay the awkward bill. Like, you can't make somebody else have to come to you and be like awkwardly like, I have questions about Jesus. Can you help me? Like we actually have to be the ones that pay the awkward bill. And I love that phrasing because it's like, yeah, it will feel awkward, but most of those awkward moments where I felt, especially leading from the Holy Spirit, God has broken through something or something happened spiritually for someone else. What are some other examples practically of either identifying with people in your chapter or seeking transformation as a leader specifically, or someone who's trying to be incarnational in their chapter? Or maybe even like, what advice would you give somebody that feels like it's awkward or they're a little scared, they have some fears about it, any of that?
I was thinking about that. So much of what I learned about, you mentioned evangelism, Kristina, like sharing Jesus with people is just like evangelism is friendship, that there's actually not any like perfect gospel presentation or perfect Bible verse that we can whip out that is like gonna compel someone to say yes to, but actually just like being a really, like I've seen it with so many people, being a really good friend and being true to someone who is following Jesus. If you spend enough time with someone that is following Jesus and you aren't, you're going to be curious about them and you're going to have questions about why they are the way that they are. And I didn't do anything special when I was in my sorority. I led a Bible study for a year, but the Bible study was fine. It wasn't anything groundbreaking. It was a fine Bible study. I really think where I saw transformation was just like being a really good friend and investing in people and caring well for them and asking them questions and like showing up. And I learned how to do that because other people did that for me. Other people who love Jesus taught me how to be a good friend. There was no secret formula that I had had to unlock that was like, oh, this is how I'm going to get my sisters to be interested in Jesus. It was like my sisters were interested in Jesus because they were like curious about my life because I spent time with them. And it has nothing to do with me or who I am and everything to do with like me trying to live a life that looked like Jesus and then trying to do that in proximity with these girls that I loved. That was really where transformation came, not in like the really elaborate and well thought out Bible studies or even like having the perfect thing to say. It was just in like being present and being myself as someone who is following Jesus.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. We've talked before about to that end, living a life that begs the question why, And I think meaning you could say like live a questionable life, not in the immoral sense, but live a life that does provoke curiosity about your lifestyle and the decisions you make. And by following Jesus and just trying to be faithful to the lifestyle that he calls us to, that will inevitably happen. Again, you're going to start to begin to engage differently. And when you do that in proximity, like in the house and at the parties and all of those things, that's where people, again, some of my most spiritual conversations, best conversations I've had about with Jesus weren't in intentional like Bible studies or spaces that I tried to create to like, hey, this is where we're going to talk about it. And those places are awesome and you should definitely do those. But some of it, the reality is like if you are leading a Bible study, that's like 60 minutes out of an entire week. But like you live with your brothers and sisters 24/7,
Right.
and so your lifestyle and just living by example, I think provokes a lot of curiosity and being prepared to like those questions are going to come up, and I think it is scary. I mean, for me personally, like I was afraid to even say the name Jesus in my fraternity when I started following Jesus. And I grew up in church, and it was terrifying. But whether you know it or not, I think when you do step out, and start living differently, or especially if you like start a Bible study, like inevitably you'll become the Jesus guy or Jesus girl of your fraternity and sorority. You'll become the late night confessional priest and stuff that people come to. And that can feel like a lot of pressure inducing. I would say there's absolute grace and you don't have to be perfect by any means. Like you're not supposed to be Jesus. You're supposed to just point them to Jesus. And I think, see those opportunities as opportunities, to come up, that when you start following Jesus, be prepared for people to ask you questions, about it and how you're going to respond and actually talk about your faith in a way that's, they can hear it and feels attractive.
Love that. And, as we talk about this, I just want to kind of end with this thought that if you're listening to this and you feel like God is calling me to be more present, he's calling me to actually be more intentional. Like there was something in this episode that you're like, I feel like God inviting me more deeply in this, but I feel alone, or I feel like I need help, or I want to be part of a bigger community that's also doing this. Please reach out to us. We love helping. We love giving. We have tons of resources. We have Bible studies written by Greeks for these chapter ministries. There's a lot of ways that there's help out there. And we're not the only organization doing it, but I would just say we would love to serve you and what God is calling you to do. And the very last thing I'll say is, and I say this all the time to people, God is already at work in your chapter. He's already at work with people's hearts. He's already been at work before people even got to college. And you get to step into this flow of what he's already doing. And there's nothing more exciting than that. At the same time, there's probably going to be pushback to that. So even as God is at work, there'll be moments where you feel like, okay, like I thought God was at work here. I thought that I was trying to be intentional. And there's some pushback because I think relatively so, we know biblically that when light comes into the darkness will try to push back. But what we saw in the scripture today, it won't overcome the light. The light wins. And so if you need encouragement too, maybe you're already doing it, but you're like, I need encouragement. Can you encourage me? Let us know. We have a lot of people that can help you right where you're at, and we can help you do that. So let's keep talking about this. I'm really excited to be more like Jesus in our chapters.
Yeah. And just practically, we have a contact card that's always listed in the show notes, no matter where you listen to this podcast. So if you're hearing Kristina say, like, let us help you, if you're interested in this, you can find that contact card in the show notes, fill it out, and one of us will reach out to you. Or just like shoot us a DM on Instagram at Greek and Christian. I will respond to you. So you'll be talking to me.
Sarah's the one behind the keys.
I'll be the one you're DMing. And we would love to talk to you more about what it looks like to actually do this. And I wanted to mention too, normally we have a fun segment that we do at the end of every episode, but we're going to switch it up on you guys a little bit today. You can listen to John and Kristina and I share stories about 10 plus years ago, all you want. The reality is that there's so many students in the country who are literally doing this. As we speak, students that will host Bible studies in their fraternities and sororities tonight and throughout the week and gather together. And I mentioned this last week, but I got to go to Purdue and hang out with the Greeks there where they have so many Bible studies happening. And I got to sit down with a Sigma Chi named Nathan, who is literally doing this in his fraternity, and get some clips of his story of him sharing how God called him into leading and planting a Bible study in his fraternity. It's a really good story, and we're going to tack it on to the end of this episode. So I'm hopeful that if you're listening to this and you're either in the thick of leading in your chapter, or maybe it's something that you're listening to this episode and you're like, man, what if I did that? That hearing Nathan's story about what is happening on campus at Purdue in his fraternity right now would be, one, encouraging and inspiring, but would also just make you feel seen, in that there are people who are doing this and doing it well, and that God is meeting him in that space where he's being really faithful. So without further ado, this is Nathan, a Sigma Chi from Purdue.
Hi, I'm Nathan Bleed. I'm at Sigma Chi at Purdue University. Yes, growing up, I would have always said I was a Christian. There's never a point in my life where I've said I wasn't a Christian. I was usually going to church on Sundays. As I got older, I started to go less and less. I went to church camp growing up, 1 or usually 2 weeks a year. Would even volunteer at some of these camps. And I had made verbal affirmations of my faith many times. I was confirmed in the Covenant Church, and I would have always said I was a Christian. Saying that, though, I'm not exactly sure what that meant. I never really had an understanding of what it meant. It was something that was important to me, but at the end of the day, I believed I was forgiven. So there was no need for me to really take anything seriously. There was no need to, repent. And I never read my Bible. I prayed occasionally, but I was never really trying to deepen my faith. It was always something that was, just good enough, or something that was enough. And never really understood, I guess, why so many people would take it so seriously, or what the point is. I always felt that those people were missing out. So coming to college, I would have categorized myself as what at least I saw as the normal college student. Most socializing and bonding with friends was around alcohol. This started in the dorms and continued when I joined a fraternity. And I wouldn't say that it was a product of the fraternity, but it is something that I think is very common at college, and something that I saw as normal, and something I saw as a lot of fun. And so I kind of just continued in that. And I think similar to growing up, I didn't really question if it was good or bad, or how it was affecting my life, my choices, my morals, my decisions, my long-term goals, and what impact it was having on me, and the impact that it was having on others through me drinking. And it was never something where I would categorize myself as a super heavy drinker, but it was the primary source of socializing for me. Everyone says college is the best 4 years of your life. So live it up, do that. And there's not really a lot of thoughts of, hey, what impact can I have on other people? How can I be, a productive member of this campus that I'm in? How can I be the best member of my fraternity? How can I make an impact while I'm here? Instead of just focusing on kind of using this college experience for what you can get out of it and then leaving. At the end of my freshman year, it was elections in the fraternity, and I really wanted to be house manager. It's just a respected position within the house, and your goal is to, keep the house clean. And it's kind of a fun position with a few other responsibilities. And it was something I really had my mind set on. And I just kind of accepted, okay, I'm going to win it. I felt like I had built up a pretty good reputation within the house, but elections came and I did not win the position. So I was pretty upset about it. I was kind of confused. I was like, why did I not win this position? But there was another position up for grabs that was called chaplain. And Obviously, that's like religious leader, Christian leader of the house. And this existed as a position in name only, is the best way I would put it. But I felt conviction. I was like, well, I'm a Christian, why should I not run for this position and try to make it into something? So I ran for the position unopposed. Nobody else wanted it. And I was like, we're going to do something with this position. So I decided I'm going to lead a Bible study in the house. I don't know where that came from. No one told me to do it. No one had done it before and was passing it on to me. I didn't even know Greek IV existed for reference. I didn't know other people were doing this in their houses, but I just felt this conviction, I would say, that if I'm going to hold this position, I'm going to do something out of it. And the easiest way I thought to do that was to lead a Bible study. So about a month before coming to Purdue, for my sophomore year, I seriously cracked open my Bible for the first time with the intention of actually reading through it and trying to figure things out from reading it. And I started reading this and I just came upon these ideas and these lessons that maybe I had been exposed to before, but I'd never actually internalized them. I'd never actually read them off the paper and go, wow, this is serious. Like, this is actually what it means. There are actual repercussions for how you live your life. How you live your life is important. Saying that all didn't happen immediately. To come back to Purdue my sophomore year, and I'm leading this Bible study in the house. Right where I'm sitting right now, I'm leading this Bible study. And at the same time, I'm living the same life that I have. But I'm learning all these new things and I'm teaching these people all these things. I'm teaching my brothers all these lessons about how we should live our life and what we should do. But at the same time, I haven't changed at all. And there was internal conflict going on because at this point, for the first time in my life, I'd say I'm seriously trying to grow my faith. I'm trying to challenge myself. I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to be a better person, but I'm not necessarily changing. I'm not experiencing, I would say, the correct levels of conviction, or at least I'm not acting on them. And that is kind of when Purdue Greek IV came into the picture. So I'm leading my Bible study in my house and it's going well. People are interested in it. I'm interested in it. I enjoy doing it. And I get this text one day and it says, "Hi, Nathan, this is Lauren from Purdue Greek IV. We'd love to meet with you." My first question is, what is Greek IV? And I wasn't excited at first. I was like, oh no, like this is going to be some organization. I'm not very involved on campus. It's like, this is going to be some organization that I'm going to have to find a way to politely decline. Like, I'm going to have to find a way to not accept. But Lauren offered to buy me coffee. So we met over coffee and she starts telling me about what Greek IV is. And that's when I found out that there's about 40 other people on campus doing exactly what I'm doing, leading Bible studies while they're in their fraternities and their sororities and trying to grow in their faith and bring others with them in this Greek life setting, which a lot of times can be hard or people think it can be hard at least. And I was like, wow. So from there, I heard about it and my mindset switched immediately. It's like, okay, let's get involved. Like, let's do this. And I had alumni reach out to me and it's like, hey, we hear you're involved with Greek IV. Like, this is great. This is something that I did when I was at campus. And I just realized that this was a tradition that had existed in our house that had kind of dissipated and that I was having the ability to bring it back. So we go to like the all Greek gatherings and it's cool. It's cool to see 150 people who are kind of like-minded to you. They obviously share a lot of the same interests as you. If they're in a fraternity or sorority, for them to come in and want to learn about Jesus, want to learn about the gospel in a fraternity or sorority house. But I would say still, even up to this point, still I was ready to change, but I wasn't changing yet. And Lauren with Greek IV, she told me that there was this thing called a campus ministry dinner. That was another thing. I was like, no, like I'm not excited for this either. But I went, and that is kind of, I would say, when I was like, okay, I actually need to change my life. I need to at least change some of the things I'm doing, because I went to this dinner and I was able to interact with all the other campus ministry leaders. And I was able to hear what their struggles are and how they're trying to better themselves. And I just felt that. I was like, wow, these people are doing this with such dedication. They're doing this with such care and such significance for their role that they have within their house. And I felt that I was not doing that at all. I felt that I could lead a good Bible study, but no one was looking to me as an example outside of this Bible study. And, you would hear side remarks like, oh, that's our Bible study leader and stuff like that, but it was all true. So going into second semester, I definitely had a deeper commitment. I was challenging myself more. I was reading every day. I was praying every day, but still definitely struggling to kind of live out the life fully, live out what I knew I was supposed to be doing. And I would say if anyone wants to deepen their faith, the best way to do that is through denial. So find something that you can get rid of that you're not going to be happy about and go from there. So the first thing was I decided we were going to do a mission trip for spring break. This is something that had been done in the house, previously before I had ever been here and I'd heard about. And I thought that this was a great place to start and a great opportunity for me to lead by example and, give up something like spring break, which a lot of people, are very excited for. I've always been very excited for. I'm a very socially active person, but I decided, I think this is a good thing to get started. We kind of just went from there. So 6 of us went down to Tennessee and we rebuilt homes after Hurricane Helen and were really able to experience how a lot of people would define being Christian in very positive ways. So that was probably a turning moment where I realized, okay, kind of everything should be centered around this. And I think that was a truth that I'd always known, but I'd never known how to live it out, or I've never seen exactly how to live it out. And I would say I think I had seen it, but I never took that example and then internalized it. And then another thing was Lent. So me and another guy in the house, we stood up a chapter. And we're saying, all right, guys, like we're not drinking for Lent. And you hear that. Guys hear that and they're like, what? Like, maybe you hear that's lame, but that was another good process because you get to see how is this thing keeping me from God? How is it keeping me from doing all these other things I want to accomplish? And through that process of denial, you get to see why people do live their lives with such a commitment to the gospel, to ministry, to, all of those things. So I would say just kind of the combination of those two events really going on this mission trip and trying to practice denial in my life, trying to give up things that are present in my life, were really important for me as a leader. So when you take this position seriously, obviously some things in your life have to change and you might feel out of place sometimes, I guess is the best way to put it. So I go to this meeting and this dinner with all the other campus ministry leaders. And it's like, okay, my life has got to change. And over the course of the year, peeling things back. But you do have a divide when you make a stance, when you say, this is what I'm going to put first in my life. This is what I'm going to prioritize. This is what I'm going to try to live my life by, especially when you're in a group setting, right? When you're in a fraternity, a lot of decisions can be group decisions, whether it's where are we going to eat or, what are we doing on Friday or, even things like what are we going to value? Like what's going to be praised and what's not going to be praised. And one thing I think back is a Bible study we did. And I don't remember the verse exactly, but it compares earthly wisdom to spiritual wisdom. And it's okay. It's like, how can you be wise on earth, but how can you be wise in your faith? How can you be wise in heavenly terms? And what you realize is they're at odds with each other. So learning that it was obvious because it was like, okay, what is my relationship supposed to be now with women? What is my relationship supposed to be now with, obviously drinking is something we talked about. What is my relationship supposed to be with success and charity and giving? How am I supposed to spend my time? And that's something you have to challenge yourself. You really have to ask yourself, and you have to ask yourself, okay, what do I think? What do I want? What are those around me? Maybe what are they encouraging versus what do I know is right? And what am I going to push for? So those are things, that you might feel out of place in a fraternity. But overall, I would say I felt more in place here than I think I would have anywhere else if I tried to do the same thing. I think it can be very intimidating for a lot of people to say, I'm going to stand up and speak about this in my chapter. I'm going to take this stance. I'm going to go against the grain, which isn't, and I don't want to say the grain like, these fraternities are just causing this and creating this, but this is the natural way of the world. But everything I've received here has been almost all positive, and being used to have this effect on my brothers has been nothing but a blessing. And while I thought that this might bring me farther from my brothers, which maybe a few it has brought me so much closer to so many of them in a lot of ways that I never would have anticipated. One thing that goes through my head a lot is there was a brother at the Catholic Church here on campus last year. His name was Brother Jacob. And as he was leaving for the year, he gave a speech to the whole church. And he said, you all are sad that I'm leaving you, but since we have built this relationship in Christ, our friendship is eternal. And I will see you all again. And I think that's such a good mindset to have when you approach this position within your houses, when you say, I want to lead within my house, is that if you do build these relationships with your brothers in Christ, they can last forever. But if you don't, they will eventually end. So now in Sigma Chi, we have our Bible study going on every week, and there's kind of just a much more open atmosphere to God, and people not only feel, I guess, more free to talk about it, but a lot of them are eager to talk about it. You see guys stand up a chapter and discuss how it's working in their lives, just discuss what they want, what they're seeking as far as in their faith and their relationship to God. And that's really a great thing to see. You also see everyone who comes to Bible study every week, and you see guys who are curious. You see guys who would probably never have this exposure because they wouldn't necessarily want to go out on campus and go to a ministry event, or they wouldn't want to just go to church by themselves. But when you have this ability to invite people just downstairs to come to Bible study or invite them to church or mass, you really do see it open these doors into a lot of people's lives who maybe it would never reach them otherwise. And then another thing I would say is that it really does open up a lot of doors for bonding with your brothers, for growing these relationships. Like I said, freshman year, it seemed like almost all my social events, either with my friends in my dorm or maybe even here, would probably revolve around, maybe having a beer or doing something. But there's no replacement for spiritual bonding. There's no replacement for growing in a relationship with someone who also has their life centered around God. There's a lot of ways you can bond with your brothers in your fraternity, but the relationships I've built with my brothers who are in Christ, who are seeking heaven with me, are the strongest ones I've built. Additionally, we've just had our alumni reach out and give overwhelming support. The alumni have been just amazing and always ready to support. One of the things they've done is one of them who lives in Guatemala has actually reached out to us, and we have 15 of us going to a mission trip there in January. Just being able to do service projects and have this super unique experience with 15 brothers is amazing. And it's something that would have never been possible if it were not for us meeting here on Monday nights and leading our Bible studies. And that's one thing I will say is I never thought the impact would be as big as it is. I never thought that I would now be leading campus ministry with Greek IV. I never thought that 15 of us would be going to a foreign country to do a mission trip, and all the other things that have come out of this. I'd never thought that they would accumulate to this. So to anyone who is thinking about, is it even worth it if I start it? I don't think you realize how big of an impact you can have.
For more on being Greek and Christian, you can follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube at Greek and Christian. Or if you're wanting more to connect with one of us, you can also fill out our contact card listed in the show notes below. We'll see you back here next episode as we dive deeper into living out your faith in your fraternity or your sorority.